There's a certain way people talk about wild hogs in Texas. It's blunt, impatient, sometimes even angry. To most landowners, they aren't animals in the traditional sense anymore. They're damaged with legs, crops flattened overnight, fences torn apart like paper, entire fields churned into mud. You hear the same thing over and over again. Get rid of them, however you can, as fast as you can. Helicopters, traps, night hunts, it doesn't matter. The goal is simple. Fewer hogs tomorrow than there were today. That mindset has shaped years of eradication efforts across the state. But during one operation, something surfaced that didn't fit that narrative at all. It started as routine footage. Thermal cameras mounted along a stretch of ranch land, meant to monitor hog movement patterns before scheduled aerial culling. The land had been hit hard in recent months. Rooting damage everywhere, water sources disturbed, grazing areas destroyed. The expectation was simple. Confirm herd size, map their routes, and plan the next removal. Nothing unusual, nothing unexpected. Just another night in a long-running war against an invasive species that seemed impossible to control. At first, that's exactly what the footage showed. Heat signatures moving through brush, clusters of animals spreading out across open ground. The familiar patterns wildlife officials had studied for years. But then something changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but enough that the people reviewing the footage paused and rewound. There was movement that didn't match the hogs. Smaller shapes, lower to ground, keeping distance but never fully leaving the frame. At a glance, it could have been dismissed as background activity. But it wasn't random. The shapes were tracking the hogs. Not in the way predators usually do. Not with immediate aggression or obvious pursuit. There was a kind of patience to it. The smaller figures adjusted their position as the hogs moved, keeping just far enough away to avoid detection. They weren't scattered either. They were spaced out almost evenly, like they were aware of each other's positions. That was the first moment something fell off. Predators don't usually move like that unless there's coordination involved. And coordination at that level, in that environment, raised questions nobody had been asking. The footage continued, and for a while nothing happened. The hogs settled into a patch of brush, some lying down, others shifting slowly, foraging, resting. It looked like the end of any ordinary tracking sequence. But the smaller shapes didn't leave. They stayed, watching, waiting. Minutes passed, then more, and then, almost without warning, everything shifted. One of the hogs, larger than the others, moved away from the group. Not far, just enough to create a small gap. It was the kind of movement that wouldn't normally matter. But the moment it happened, the smaller figures adjusted instantly. The spacing changed. The stillness broke. What followed didn't look like chaos. It looked intentional. The first movement was fast, almost too fast to register in real time. One of the smaller shapes darted forward, then pulled back just as quickly. It didn't make contact. It didn't try to attack. It just got close enough to trigger a reaction. The hog turned sharply, attention fixed on that single point. And that's when the rest moved. From the sides, from angles that had been carefully maintained, the others closed in, not on the adult hog, but on something behind it, something smaller, something that hadn't even been clearly visible until that moment. Piglets, several of them, clustered low in the brush, nearly invisible against the ground. What happened next lasted only seconds, but it changed the entire interpretation of what the footage meant. There was no prolonged struggle, no loud confrontation, just precise, targeted movement. One of the smaller figures reached the piglets, made contact, and retreated almost immediately. Another followed, then another. Each movement was quick, controlled, and deliberate. By the time the adult hog reacted fully and turned back, it was already too late. The smaller figures were gone, disappearing into the brush as quietly as they had arrived. The piglets weren't. When the footage was reviewed again, frame by frame, the pattern became clearer. This wasn't random opportunism. It wasn't a lucky break for a scavenger. It was a method, a repeatable, structured behavior that suggested something far more complex than anyone had accounted for in their management strategies. The realization didn't come all at once. It built slowly, piece by piece, as more footage was analyzed. Similar patterns appeared in different locations at different times. The same spacing, the same patience, the same sudden, coordinated movements, and always the same target. Not the adult hogs, not the large, dangerous animals that dominated the landscape. The focus was always on the next generation. That's when the conversation started to shift. For years, eradication efforts had focused almost entirely on adult populations. The logic made sense. Remove the biggest animals, reduce immediate damage, lower breeding capacity. It was straightforward, measurable, and visible. But the footage suggested something different, something that hadn't been fully considered. The idea that the real pressure point in the population wasn't the adults at all, but the survival rate of the young. And more importantly, that something in the environment had already figured that out. The animals captured in the footage weren't new to the region. They had always been there, moving to the same landscapes, largely ignored or dismissed as secondary players in the ecosystem. They weren't seen as a solution to anything. If anything, they were often treated as another problem to manage. But what the cameras revealed suggested they had been adapting quietly, developing strategies that directly impacted the very population humans were struggling to control. It raised uncomfortable questions. If these patterns had been happening for years, why hadn't they been recognized sooner? How many times had similar footage been overlooked, dismissed as insignificant? And perhaps most importantly, how had management strategies failed to account for something that appeared to be so consistent once you knew what to look for? The deeper researchers looked, the more the picture changed. Field reports that once seemed unrelated began to align. Missing piglets, disturbed nesting areas, subtle shifts in hog behavior that didn't quite make sense at the time. Individually, they hadn't meant much. Together, they told a different story. It wasn't just about predation. It was about adaptation. The smaller predators weren't engaging in direct conflict with adult hogs because they didn't need to. They had identified a vulnerability that required less risk and offered consistent results. Instead of confronting strength, they targeted opportunity. Instead of reacting, they anticipated. And over time, that behavior had become refined, almost systematic. What made it unsettling wasn't just the effectiveness. It was the implication. While humans have been investing millions into controlling hog populations through increasingly aggressive methods, something else had been working in parallel, using entirely different tactics. And in some cases, those tactics appear to be more efficient, more sustainable, and far less disruptive to the surrounding environment. That didn't mean the problem was solved. Far from it. Hog populations were still massive, still destructive, still expanding in many areas. But it introduced a new variable into a situation that had long been viewed as one-dimensional. It suggested that the ecosystem itself wasn't as passive as it had been assumed to be. There was resistance, not in the way people expected, not through direct confrontation, but through subtle, continuous pressure applied at exactly the right point. The footage didn't show a dramatic victory. It didn't capture a moment where the balance suddenly tipped. What it showed was quieter than that. Ongoing, persistent, a process that didn't rely on sudden impact, but on accumulation over time. And that's what made it so easy to miss. Because it didn't look like control. It didn't look like intervention. It looked like background noise. Until someone stopped and really watched. As more operations incorporated similar monitoring, the pattern continued to appear. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but often enough to confirm it wasn't an isolated incident. It was a behavior spreading through certain predator populations, likely learned, possibly even passed down through generations. That idea, learning, adaptation, transmission, added another layer to the situation. It meant this wasn't just instinct. It was something evolving in response to environmental pressure, a response shaped not only by the presence of hogs, but by the absence of other prey, by changes in land use, by human intervention itself. In a way, it was a feedback loop. Humans altered the environment. Predator behavior shifted. That shift began to affect the very problem humans were trying to solve. But because the focus had been so narrow, so fixed on direct action, the broader interaction had gone largely unnoticed. The disturbing part wasn't what the predators were doing. It was how long it had taken to realize they were doing it at all. And once that realization set in, It became harder to ignore the possibility that other unseen dynamics might be at play, other interactions, other adaptations, happening just outside the focus of traditional management strategies. It forced a reconsideration, not just of tactics, but of perspective. Maybe the goal wasn't simply to remove as many hogs as possible as quickly as possible. Maybe it required understanding the system they existed within, the pressures acting on them from multiple directions, the factors influencing not just their numbers, but their behavior. Because the footage made one thing clear. The landscape wasn't static. It wasn't waiting for a solution to be imposed on it. It was already responding, already adjusting, already pushing back in ways that didn't fit neatly into established plans. And if those responses were overlooked or worse, disrupted without understanding their role, the consequences could be the opposite of what was intended. The operation that captured that footage didn't end differently than others on the surface. Hogs were removed. Damage was reduced, at least temporarily. But the way it was interpreted afterward changed. The conversations that followed weren't just about numbers anymore. They were about interactions, relationships, systems. What had been seen as a straightforward problem started to look more like a complex network of cause and effect, where actions in one area could ripple outward in unexpected ways. And that's where the real shift began. Not in the field, not in the moment of the hunt, but in the understanding of what had been there all along, moving quietly through the brush, shaping outcomes without ever being the focus of attention. The footage didn't reveal a new threat. It revealed something that had been operating in the background for years, unnoticed, unacknowledged, but undeniably present. And once you see it, you can't unsee it.